so much for being here for this attempt to pull together, weave, think, round table. We are very pleased to have you here, and especially for everyone who's come through all of this, and thanks for everyone who made this possible, Shonda and all of the staff. Thank you. Dealing with the possible marathon first thing in the morning, you are beyond gold. So to begin, I'm wearing a t-shirt that says, "If I had a hammer, I would smash patriarchy." And then she says, "I found it!" So to begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are on land that belongs to the Siouan and the Cherokee peoples, that enslaved labor and debt peonage have helped make Duke possible, as well as the noxious weed of tobacco and dirty energy. I also wanted to acknowledge that there are loved ones who could not be here with us because of illness, and I know we're all very much missing Evelyn Hammond's presence, and I hope she feels our good vibes going over to her. I also am very inspired by the wonderful performativity last night, so I'm going to sing you a song, and I would like you to try to sing along with me. I'll just go through it 3 times, and if you are good, excellent. Haven't really warmed up, so don't feel bad. Freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom, freedom is coming, oh yes I know. Freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom, freedom is coming, oh yes I know. Freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom, freedom is coming, oh yes I know. Okay, so thank you so much of what this conference was about, I think, has to do with those questions that are in that song. One is, of course, what is freedom? What does it mean for it to be coming? And becoming was such an important theme through a lot of the papers here. And knowing. How do we know? How would we know when it got here? And I think that actually connects to a lot of the other sort of big categories. Feminism, is it here yet? Et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to sort of keep that as one of the things that we're playing with. I'm wearing this t-shirt that says Pink Freud. In part because psychoanalysis and the pinko, right, the communists, or the Marxists, has been such an important undercurrent in a lot of the papers and thinking that we've been doing here together. As well as very strong questions about all sorts of differences, right? Sexual difference, racial difference, sexuality differences, patriarchal, et cetera, et cetera. How do we sort of think through freedom, coming, and knowing with these questions? And I don't know if you can see this, but there's these great things on the back. And before I begin to introduce folks, I actually wanted to throw out a couple phrases that were very striking to me from some of the readings that we did. One is, "Our indignant breasts demand pure air in order to live." "Paradoxes are what make movements move." "The visionary progressive politics in pursuit of what has not yet been thought, lead to more complex meanings of egalitarian futures." So, what we have, very much like Slippage today, is a round table that is pulling together many ideas that have been crowdsourced from the wonderful sets of talks and readings that we have been given for this workshop. And I think we're all trying to figure out this far-off country and how to make it dangerous again. So I'm going to finish here and introduce our speakers, and then just say a couple things when we wind up. The idea is for folks to speak 7 to 12 minutes. Hopefully you have plenty of time for questions. And I believe we will start, if it's all right, with Rebecca. Is that okay? Rebecca wants you to know, among the very formal and important things that you know from reading her biography, that she is a big fan of Bitch Planet and of Deadpool. And I believe she is now a mortgage holder. Welcome back to the world of debt. So, thank you.
All right, so I hope my comments will invite a conversation. Do you not hear me? Oh, here we go. All right. How's that? Better? Okay. I hope my comments will invite a conversation about the nexus of the corporeal, particularly the corpse, space, and the importance of speculation as a response to the observation of the body and particular places. So if theory helps us see the world differently or rescript the normative and invites us to reread our individual scholarly archives, I thought I'd take the opportunity of using the generative theoretical frameworks offered over the last day and a half and apply them to a particular object as a case study that I've been working on, which is St. Louis, Michael Brown, and Ferguson. And so specifically, I want to think about speculation, and I'll draw on Ranjit Khanna's generative and expansive discussion here, and how that does the necessary work of helping us imagine otherwise in social movements when we may be hampered by historical framing of difference that may trap us into responses that cannot imagine truly new forms of self-creation. And I should say, I wrote this thinking I would do a PowerPoint, but apparently if the screen came down, it would hit us all in the head, and so you will have to imagine some things. I apologize. And there was going to be a clip from Meet Me in St. Louis, which you're not going to get anymore. Yeah, not so much. So the black body is so often treated as open, observable, transparent, although the interpretations, as we know, are widely varying. And one of the things that recordings of police violence against mostly black subjects have taught us, visibility and the visual record can be used as evidence for vastly different conceptions of guilt and responsibility. As objects of speculation, black bodies, and I'm saying specifically black bodies and not black subjects, an essential difference that we may not parse out enough in critical race studies, is also haunted by profit and loss. Capitalism shaped their subjectivity under slavery and colonialism, and blackness as a category in itself, as well as the post-imaginaries that shape possibilities for their progress. If we bring speculation to bear to a reading of the scene of Michael Brown's corpse, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, feminist texts were often not transparent to many people as necessary to interpreting the case. The autopsy, the scripts of black criminality, and in some cases, discourses that emphasize the specificity of injury to black men that exclude black women in the history of state violence, informed the many national conversations. But Brown's death was, following Gracetta Pollock by way of Adriana Cavarero, horror that is an ontological crime, an assault against the human condition, and to many, evidence of constant efforts to annihilate all black citizens. Thus, in focusing on what happens to a black masculine subject here, I am not displacing women as an object of inquiry, but following the lines of connection that have been drawn by many activists themselves. Black women founded Black Lives Matter, as we know, and they drew on intersectionality and their attentiveness to state violence, recognizing state crimes against queer, poor, black, and immigrant subjects. Black Lives Matters, as an essential part of Alvarez's uncivic society and feminist activist assemblages, is feminist, anti-racist, anti-poverty, and queer rights movement that makes these activist projects a real threat. And despite many concerns about fourth wave difference from older social movement practices, and I can't believe how many conversations I've had with people who keep trying to say it's not a movement all the time, the social media and these contemporary assemblages exist alongside of, precede, and follow the complex fields of feminist activism. And part of the work of feminist scholars they must do, as Alvarez usefully suggests, is incorporate this movement and other movements around the world about state violence as essential to understanding how feminisms have moved. Moreover, the construction of black motherhood, an issue so essential to black feminist theory, has been essential to how agents and defenders of the state discursively reject accusations of state violence. While these mothers may not understand themselves as part of the field of feminism, Mothers of murdered black men are always indicted as allegedly monstrous mothers, producing allegedly monstrous children, and their activism has been essential, and we could add Eric Garner's daughter to this discourse, to try to redirect national affect from a politics of disposability by grounding the story of their deaths to their grief. They inform the context that paradoxically require us to look at death and to indict the looking. We want people to remember, but there's the question of whether or not we're reducing Michael Brown the corpse to a thing in the repetition. We have so often been required to look and witness, but also recognize the ethical problem of the look because of the danger that in indicting how subjects become bodies by witnessing the bare life of subjected black citizens, they may become reified into things. It thus seems hard to imagine a way of understanding African American identity that is not defined by opposition. I'm sort of inspired by Rosa's prompts here, but the desire to embrace a subjectivity that is not opposition runs through so many black cultural productions and statements of political desire. We may wish, indeed, to speculate when and where was the place the difference preceded identity. It is both an imagined past and also a desired future. In examining the injustice of a particular place, St. Louis, it is impossible to understand it without understanding the nexus of time, identity, and space. To get to a place where there is difference that is not opposition, it may be necessary to change a space before you change the subjects. And yet subjects need to change, particularly subjects who are signatories, as social theorists such as Charles Mills, Carol Pateman, and Cricket Keating have argued, to social contracts that maintain racial, sexist, heteronormative, and class hegemonies. Changing the space, the comfortable presence of some citizens, interpretations of the past, the possibilities for the future, has been essential to various activist groups in St. Louis, and they cannot imagine doing their work, I would suggest, without speculating on the possibility of justice. Temporality is key. If we understand justice as restorative in relationship to a past with an uncountable lost and injured, what is indeed a past that cannot ever make subjects or groups whole, then justice is in fact never possible. But if justice is, as Rawls argues, and be clear, I'm not following everything Rawls suggests, but it's just a prompt, fairness can be speculated on as something that can be reached in the present and must be reached in the future. The question that animates such projects is, yes, ethically, how do we live well? Although that can be a question that some people can only aspire to, as the first question is the more basic, how does one live? One of the major themes connecting the talks today is the temporality of social justice. In the case of psychoanalysis, melancholy is deeply important in thinking about social movements, as temporality is at the core of what is a too lengthy attachment to lost love objects, and the state produces these melancholic subjects, constantly dealing with and trying to find a way to deal with multiple sites of loss and a devaluation of self that they cannot and should not let go of as an originary injury. How have social movements moved through time? And how do we move social movements? In putting Pollock and Alvarez in conversation with each other, it is interesting to think about what feminism remembers and forgets, and which events may count as feminist traumas. And finally, Gross's work, most of all, is interested in how feminists should rethink our relationship to time in relationship to social justice projects. Feminist theory is largely animated by the idea of making political progress. Essentialist frameworks and cultural feminism aside, it is in most forms a field developed to respond to the problem of structural inequality shaped by categorizations of gender and sexuality. And the dream may be that activism will result in the end of feminist theory that responds to this problem. And as anyone who has ever taught Intro to Women's Studies knows, many of our students will locate feminism in US context as an activism only needed in the past, and our work as teachers is to crush that delusion with every class meeting. But with liberal feminism's success, the dominance of, and I'll just say it, the popularization of things like Sheryl Sandberg's Leading In, that blames women for the failure to thrive, part of what has been popularized, while not empirically true in many contexts, is that US women have arrived at a largely equal future, and that the feminist project was famously dead, or at least emaciated. So part of what Black Lives Matter and other social movements that emphasize the necessity of intersectionality and activism does is demonstrate inequality and a failure to thrive that liberal feminism can mask. And of course, attacks on abortion have sort of destabilized that sense in some ways. And I've come to see that part of the work of social movements is to recognize that we must deal with what I term competing temporalities between different populations, signifying progress, fall, or no movement at all. And so, this is where we're going to have a very brief clip, that one of the most popular sites that signifies competing temporalities to me is Meet Me in St. Louis, a film that has often been described as putting St. Louis on the map, a nostalgic film about the World's Fair or Louisiana Exposition of 1903. And it was understood as the peak of St. Louis as a city of the future, that was their language. But by the time the film was released in 1945, St. Louis was already understood as having its best days behind it. And Judy Garland's character sings of her longing for this handsome neighbor next door who she believes doesn't know she exists. So it's clear there's no hope. I'm not going to sing this. For me, though I live at 5135 Kensington Avenue and he lives at 5133. One of the interesting things is there is a real 5135 Kensington Avenue, and like many St. Louis homes that are north of Del Mar, which is understood as the Del Mar Divide, it's been demolished. And many of the large turn-of-the-century homes that do remain are in these states of disrepair, including the home of the boy next door. And the film was released the same year as Shelley v. Kramer, which was an important Supreme Court case originating in St. Louis that outlawed housing covenants that prohibited black families from living in white neighborhoods. And we can't understand Ferguson without understanding white flight, the configuration of who white people, particularly white women, should and should not live next to, or without understanding Pruitt-Igoe, which was described as the public housing of the future in the 1960s and 70s, occupied largely by single African-American mothers and their children. But how often do feminists make housing and racist housing law important to a history of feminist activism? Some have, of course, particularly those attentive to the history of welfare, but it's important to recognize how these spaces shape the possible futures of so many in the African-American community. So conflicts and feminisms are often configured as a failure to mourn the same lost objects. While Garland's song of heteronormative desire is not a particularly feminist site, the Lost Home here is a site of loss that I would suggest should be understood as a space for feminist activism. And remapping the terrain of feminism, temporal, melancholic, the monstrous, and trauma, seems to be the work of the feminist present and future.
To present Claudia, who is working, as you know, from her written description of herself, but trying to find ways in which decolonial feminism can find points of conversation with all sorts of other struggles. So, and I love that she talked about this in a very embodied way. So, thank you.
We must be very tired, so I'll try to be brief, but I cannot speak very fast, so bear with me. Thank you very much for the organizers to invite me, for inviting me to be here. And as I was participating, listening to the keynote speakers, and then in our workshop, I've been constantly engaged in translation, not only translation between, what US feminists are saying, Brazilian feminists are saying, but also interlinguistic translation. I mean, trying to understand. Sometimes I would catch some things, but the middle would be a blank. So I was trying to fill the void, but sometimes didn't make sense. So I was also struggling to understand what some of the papers were very dense, and I wanted to follow. And sometimes it was difficult for me because of the problem of two languages, two worldviews, and lack of familiarity with some frameworks. So I was constantly during all this time engaging in translation. So, and translation has been a very key enterprise for my academic, doing both in Brazil and the United States, just, coming and going all the time from Brazil to here, from here to Brazil, always also engaged in translating, taking theoretical concepts to Brazil, translating them, and seeing if they fit or not. So this has been the major aspect of my, let's say, business. And now in my readings about the ontological turn, indigenous cosmopolitanism, I've been also thinking about translation and in the sense of how to put heterogeneous worlds, the world of Western feminism and non-Western decolonial feminism, in dialogue. How to put in dialogue what the new materialist feminists are saying, based on vitalist philosophies, and what indigenous cosmologists have been saying all the time. So, and how to articulate then with what the colonial feminists are saying in an attempt not to delink the colonial feminists from Western feminism, but to relink them in more productive ways. So according to indigenous cosmopolitanism, there are different perspectives from different worlds, natures, and not different perspectives of the same world, nature. So instead of having a universe, we have pluriverses. So I want to bring the concept of equivocation from a meridian perspectivism and theorized by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro to be able to build this dialogue, okay? Equivocation points to the fact that there are different perspectives of different worlds and not different perspectives of the same world. Put otherwise, it means one culture shared by humans and non-humans and many natures, many bodies, multiple reference, instead of the Western notion of many cultures, one nature. So the theory of translation articulated by American perspectivism, Meridian perspectivisms, conceives of the act of translation as a process of equivocation. That means the same word has different reference. To translate is to potentialize equivocation. It is to explore the difference between what A and what B are saying. That is, equivocation is conceived as mediating differences among concepts without fixing them, without making them commensurate. Translation, then, is what enables partial articulation between and among heterogeneous worlds and natures. One instance of the positivity of the concept of translation as equivocation for feminism is counterintuitively the very negation of the project of translation altogether. And this is what I think that we also, when I say negating the project of translation altogether, is exploring the elements of dialogue that bypass language also, bypass the linguistic realm. So to argue for this alternative, I would like to ask, what if we circumvent our reliance on language and our search for commensurability of meaning, and as the cosmopolitical project allows us to envision, turn to other dimensions of being in these heterogeneous worlds among other human and non-human beings? My provocative question is translation, even equivocal translation, necessary for the building of partial connection amongst the pluriversality of worlds? Feminism cosmopolitical projects have been quite busy mobilizing these other dimensions. And here I'm alluding to the recent feminist emphasis on affect, to the fantastic work by so-called material feminists in the hard sciences, what they are doing to dismantle the dichotomy between nature, culture, as well as to the contributions by those working on non-representational theories. If time allows me, I will conclude my remarks by way of illustration with a few minutes of a film by the Mauritian director Sissako entitled Bamako. Have you seen that movie, Bamako? So as the description goes, Bamako is a film about African civil society taking the World Bank and the IMF to a trial court, blaming them for Africa's woes, the economic inequities of globalization. The trial court is set up in the courtyard of a house that is shared by more than one family. While the court proceedings happen, daily life goes on in the courtyard. Women bathe children, they wash clothes, cross the courtyard while doing other chores and going about their daily business, and people enter and leave the courtyard. So there's this trial, and crossing the space, several other things are happening. But voice, the movie is very much about voice. The materiality of voice interspersed with the materiality of silence is what is most intense in the film. The voice of the and pleas of the testimonies in the trial is all the time projected through loudspeakers from the courtyard to the villagers outside, who are listening and not listening while engaged in their daily tasks. We also hear the voice of the bar singer Mele, one of the main characters in the film, singing in the bar in a tone full of lament while trying to hide her tears. She and her husband are on the verge of breaking up, and their daughter is very sick. This voice, the voice of Mele, opens up the film and closes it. However, the culminating two moments of the film, and for me the most intense and telling ones, is one, when an African witness stands up to testify in the courtyard, but instead of speaking, remains silent for a few seconds in front of the microphone and leaves. And the second moment is when an old man who had attempted to testify out of his turn finally speaks. His speech, which is delivered as a chant, lasts for long minutes and is in a language other than French, which is Mali's official language, or Bambara, the most widely spoken language. While he chants, the camera explores the face of those listening. They are not understanding either. His speech is not translated for us, for those in the courtyard, for the villagers outside. And it's clear that although we and everyone else in the courtyard do not understand the words being uttered, we feel deeply that what the old man means. There is no need of translation. If he were to be translated, the fact and affect of his voice, of his chant, would be lost. This is what I mean to circumvent language and translation. The materiality of voice, the guttural sound of the old man's voice, speaks of the untranslatability and incommensurability of his world as loudly as the silence of the other witness and the melancholic voice of Mele speak of theirs. Untranslatability, therefore, allows us, Western viewers, to feel partially connected to the African witness worlds. To conclude these remarks, I would say that this is not equivocal translation, but the sheer materiality of non-translation that is able to make us, partially connected to this other world. So, although translation is very important, sometimes we need to circumvent language. We need to go into other realms of existence that some of the speakers, for instance, Elizabeth Bruce, spoke when she reread the work of Irigaray here for us. And so this is what I've been thinking, and I've been, although engaged here in translation, I was also, in other ways, partially connected to the keynote speakers. Thank you.
would like you to know that she is a mistress of the minor arts, in case you saw her knitting throughout everything, and that it's actually her who should have won the Oscar because she has been seriously wounded and revenanted back. So please welcome Jill.
Mike, sorry. So I'm going to be very brief. I wanted to leave time for questions and discussion. And I think probably everybody is exhausted by now. Like everyone else, I wanted to express deep gratitude to Shonda Corbett and Kim Carlisle, who have made the Feminist Workshop run so smoothly, and to Priscilla for conducting the orchestra. I also wanted to give a shout out to Ranji Khanna, because when I thought back on it this weekend, when I first came to Duke, Ranji had organized a working group on the feminism, transnationalism, and the international, which essentially fostered this book I've just finished. And I realized this weekend that basically between that and 10 years of feminist theory workshops, she has defined my entire intellectual professional life. So thank you. And you are in no way to blame for anything that follows hereafter. So as I finally managed to grab a spare moment on Thursday afternoon to turn to the readings for this year's workshop, I made the mistake of taking one last glance at my email, and dozens and then quickly hundreds of emails had shown up in my inbox. And they were all regarding the murder of Berta Cáceres, a Honduran activist who struggled tirelessly for indigenous rights, human rights, and environmental justice. She had won the prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize last year in recognition of her activism against a major hydroelectric plant, the Aguasarca Dam, and had received death threats only a week before she was gunned down early Thursday morning. Since the news of the assassination got out, soon after her murder, activists exchanged ideas over email and social media about how best to respond. So this murder and the response to it occupied my thoughts as I read the selected materials and listened to this year's keynote lectures. I think I was more attuned than ever to questions that participants raised this year about what feminist theories offer us for activism, for pedagogy, and for social movements. The Cáceres case seemed relevant throughout these 2 days of conversations, as discourses of disposability have been applied to the entire Central American subcontinent. Cáceres has maintained a form and enacted a form of decolonial environmental feminism. Throughout the workshop, emails kept rolling in considering whether we should circulate a petition or call our senators to protest Honduras's illegitimate government, one that the United States has supported. I thought of the futility of contacting our North Carolina senators, Tom Tillis and Richard Burr, even as I recognized the witness bearing that it's meant to occasion. For Burr and Tillis, Cáceres was part of what Ranji, following Bertrand Ogilvie, dubs garbage can populations, those who will never be counted at all, but who are left to die. But Cáceres was not the abject homo soccer, or in her case, the femisoccer, of refugee detention camps. How we respond to her death still carries implications for those who can be killed and those who can be sacrificed, conjuring the specter of hundreds of thousands of other refugees and would-be refugees. That is to say, the honoring of Cáceres, which is important, also highlights the failure to honor so many others. The discussions here reminded me of the concept of fluidarity, a concept that Diane Nelson coined in her first book, Finger in the Wound, which is dedicated, in addition to her partner Mark, to the memory of another murdered Central American activist, Myrna Mac Chung. Fluidarity, Diane explains, quote, problematizes the traditions of solidarity that lean on solid identities and clear-cut divisions between victim and victimizer. It plays with the idea of solidarity in an attempt to keep its vitally transnational relations open and at the same time question its tendency toward rigidity, its reliance on solid, unchanging identifications, and its often unconscious hierarchizing. Our discussions here about the relations between solidarity and difference, between melancholia and revolt, between justice and the impossibility of justice, seem also to lead us toward what I've come to think of as a dissensus feminism, in which the strength of feminist critique, as in psychoanalysis, lies not in the settling of matters, but in a persistent interrogation, an embrace of the uncertainty, and a recognition, as Sonia Alvarez puts it, Their paradoxes are what makes movements move. Indeed, in my own research on the 1975 International Women's Year, the most enduring legacies emerge precisely from the moments that set these paradoxes in relief. But the turn to decolonial feminism has led to an interrogation of all the categories of difference. So the question that someone asked, I think yesterday, of Liz Gross, about what we do with these categories of intersectionality that come essentially from a Western model of a colonial imposition of which categories count. So the problem that Ranji described of yet to be imagined forms of difference conjured by post-colonial theory and psychoanalysis, or Liz Gross's explanation of the ephemeral, imperceptible, incorporeal difference of the Stoics, raise questions about what we do with the categories we recognize as powerful fictions. We might consider, for example, the widespread rejection of the phrase, all lives matter, as a universalism that threatened to diminish the force and specificity of the Black Lives Matter movement, as Rebecca has demonstrated, certainly the most important contemporary social movement today. It's a case that highlights the ways in which these categories don't simply police the imaginaries, they also inspire them. Making them infinitely porous, in fact, carries a price, and a price that we need to recognize. Similarly, Era's and Francis's questions to Sonia about what we gain and what we lose when we dispense with normativity entirely, when we try to organize without a program, point back to the challenges of what it means to totally let go of these categories that still can carry not just juridical power, as we see from the intersectionalities work, but real social and movement power. In other words, I'm left wondering here where the endless contingencies and multiplicities of feminism, which have immense explanatory and analytical power, leave us in terms of showing fluidarity with someone like Berta Cáceres. Is there a moment when the always becoming of feminism needs to give way to a momentary fixing of it? And is there any possibility, if not of justice, then at least of some form of translation, as Claudia has highlighted, to make this tragedy understandable or comprehensible to a larger public? Thank you.
Frances wants you to know that if you have questions about, I'm going to say it wrong, matrixiologics, she can answer them because she has watched all of Separated at Birth for the last 4 years.
Not Separated at Birth. She made me tell her something like that. Yes. So I will be brief as well. So that we can open things up. I just have some observations and questions on Feminist Theory Workshop 2016, 10th anniversary. So the observations and questions are concerned with what is and what might be more possible in feminist theory and movement if, as Liz Gross says, everything remains to be thought again. So some observations. It seems important to recognize, as sometimes we might be talking past each other, but to recognize that method and objective analysis, which are largely informed by our disciplinary training, structure our intellectual, creative, and concept projects and what counts as feminist theory. Feminist theorists have different relations to classical disciplines. I would sort of prefer that we as scholars, thinkers, and actors in the world be more explicit about the institutional, political, economic conditions of knowledge production and feminist theorizing, as well as how disciplinary differences in academic institutions structure our choices and the work we do. My second observation is about, and related, it's about the politics of knowledge production, or maybe the knowledge power nexus, which always haunts feminist theory, and I think it comes up in all of these comments. This knowledge production system is racialized and structured by our present conditions, colonial, racist, capitalist, and imperialist. It is extractive and often violent in its ways. As Liz pointed out during the Q&A yesterday, there is no justice, rather there is nothing but responsibility. To affirm is to remember and take responsibility for. What does that mean for feminist theory? To call on the spirits of Adrienne Rich and Audre Lorde, I would hope that responsibility translates not only into self-healing, to which I am fully committed, but also to risk-taking projects and a politics of location that only begins from the self-body and mind. My third observation, and this comes from Sonia Alvarez's reading and lecture this morning, I'm reminded that most feminist and women's movements are produced in connection. For activists, theorists, and laborers informed by feminist sensibilities, and I met somebody who works at a domestic, she's a social worker at a domestic violence house in Durham, in downtown Durham. She was here yesterday. So for activists, theorists, and laborers informed by feminist sensibilities, feminism and feminist theory is multinodal, contested, and polycentric. The impulses of hegemonic or authorized feminist theories, however, increasingly seem to move inward and draw on limited genealogical lines, as indicated by the bibliography problem raised on Friday by a scholar from Latin America. I don't know if you're here. Fourth observation is these are feminist theories' questions of difference and inequality. I'd rather we not shy away from using feminist theory to engage with paradoxes and tensions, that I'd rather we name the manifold relations of power and inequality all of us are implicated in, maybe on a more regular basis. Here I call on the Evelyn Hammond's essay, which reminds readers of the salutary possibilities offered by disagreement and fragmentation, which are always present in any room, whether acknowledged or not. Such acknowledgement aligns with Liz's insistence on difference as constitutive and productive, and Sonia's discussion of feminist fields of action that are always moving, fragmenting, and realigning. Can we affirm a life of the mind and lives enacted and practiced at the same time? 5, I agree with Ranji's point in the assigned article that change is not necessarily a positive thing, and it matters to examine things as they are. But I also wondered with her who and what ideas are expendable and disposable. How do we avoid burying them or holding them in permanent abeyance? 6, while I not fully, appreciate psychoanalytic theory, the Griselda Pollock assigned reading reminded me of how much of this frame itself relies on a fantasy. Peace is not possible to me simply through psychic forms of recognition. It must address fundamental material maldistributions and relations of subordination. To recognize a point raised during Q&A this morning, full recognition would anyhow require having the ability to speak and be legible as a grown-up in the world system of power. It includes being given, quote, permission to narrate, unquote, to quote the title of a 1984 essay by Edward Said in the London Review of Books. Who gets to speak their horror in Bracha Ettinger's work, and whose story is much less likely to be heard, let alone told, to Ettinger? A psychoanalytic frame here, even a feminist one, does not address or ameliorate violent erasure of some humans and appropriation of olive groves, water, houses, family photos, book collections, and land. No measure of feminist compassion in art gets us past some of these fundamental contradictions. And then I just have some questions. So first, was philosophy, Liz somebody raised it and I was thinking it. Was philosophy a religion for the pre-Socratic Greeks? This is in relation to Liz's talk. How do we avoid simple-minded materialism but recognize that in fact there are many cosmologies that do take and have taken the incorporeal seriously? Whose time are we talking about? 2, what can we do to widen the lens of what is legible and recognized as feminist theory? who is included and not included in the feminist theory we, for example, in the article by Joan Scott, whose, quote, circulating critical passions, unquote, are legible in that article. Whose time are we talking about? How do we maintain feminist theory as a, quote, restless critical operation, unquote? And then 3, to consider in a different frame Scott's narrative of feminist historians' romance with mobility and escape in the assigned reading. What would it mean to dwell and to explicitly name exactly where our theory comes from, to name its limits and possibilities in each case? What feminist theory is able to travel and why? What would it mean if all feminist scholars assigned, read, and engaged as theory the unfamiliar, uncomfortable, difficult to understand, and possibly irrelevant? Many of us do it on a regular basis because we value the stretching and mind expansion that is required. Thank you.